back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice, and I'm the lead pastor at Faith Community CRC in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. But we realize that whenever Reformation happens in the history of the church, things get messy. And things continue to be messy in the Christian Reformed Church. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation might look like. It's also important for you to know that you are our marketing plan. We rely on you to spread the word about what we're doing at the Messy Reformation. We rely on you to share our content. And we rely on you to give us 5-star reviews and give good feedback for our podcast. You are the marketing plan. You can also support us financially on Patreon or Substack. All of the money raised is used to further the mission and the platform of the Messy Reformation. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part 2 of Willie and Dan's conversation with Chris Ganski on Synod 2025.
However, I want your opinion on this too. What do you think was the most challenging or difficult thing that Synod took up, on the floor this year?
I don't think there's one thing that stands out for me, to be honest. I don't know. What is your thought on that?
I mean, I could go like 6 different ways with this. I mean,
yeah.
Virtual church, the authority of the church on baptism, categories of gravamen, covenant for office bearers, medical assistance in dying. I mean, and that's just 5 off the top of my head. Go ahead.
Here's what I would say. I mean, I think all those conversations, and I suppose it just depends on what you're really passionate and invested in as a delegate. Like, what are the things that you see are as like really important for the church? And I think we all kind of have different ones. But what I will say, if I could make an observation about Synod this year, my concern going into Synod was that it was going to be a hard pull to the right, scorched earth. We're going to get all of the dissent out by any means necessary with a heavy hammer. And I was ready to come in and resist that. Not because I'm fully on board with the HHR and with the need for gravamen and confessional alignment, but how you go about it matters. And if you want to have a scorched earth approach to the holiness and the purity of the church, what's left behind is scorched earth. And so this is where one of the ways that I tried to think about this Synod is that this Synod really is about how we as a church hold together the attributes of the church's oneness and its holiness. And you need both, oneness and holiness. And you can be lopsided in either direction, and you have to hold them in tension. And I thought that the Synod was holding in tension the oneness of the church and the holiness of the church. And if you look at all the overtures that came to Synod that were asking for more oversight, accountability, and even discipline, none of those overtures were accepted in full and adopted. But all of those overtures, minus maybe 1 or 2, were partially adopted, but then modified to be not maybe as harsh or strict in how they wanted to do things. So in my case, we had Overture 7, which was a big one related to the advisory boards and board members. And I know that I know people on boards that really are tracking against the denomination's position. And so instead of acceding and saying, yeah, let's set up a synodically appointed advisory committee or that interviews board members, we're going to ask the boards themselves to have more ownership and kind of share a little bit more with Synod how they go about choosing, having these rubrics. And so we thought, on the one hand, this was a call for the holiness piece, the accountability of alignment. On the other hand, we're honoring the integrity of those agencies to take responsibility for that process on their own, and sort of holding those together. And I feel like, for the most part, all the conversations, like we accepted, like with the RCA. I thought that was really important. We said, hey, we're heading in different directions as a denomination, and this is concerning to us, but we're not really willing to call it quits right now and just redesignate our relationship. We're going to give some time and let things work itself out. And even the Classis Toronto appeal that set the sort of tone for Synod. And I think that was the first major item of business, arguably the most difficult because nobody knew where Synod was going to go. We accepted the appeal of those Toronto churches that were objecting to decisions of the Classis to seat covenant people who couldn't sign the covenant office bearers. And we said, you're right, they were wrong. But we did not accept the sort of a more punitive approach to bringing them in line. And I think that was that was a pattern that repeated itself throughout our Synod. I was happy with, I think there was any decision made where I was like, oh man, that was a huge mistake. Or there were some things I was like, I can see both sides on this.
Yeah, I think like as I was listening, I was really excited about having you on this episode because of like how you set up the theological framework that you gave when you talked about Overture 7, holiness and unity and trust. And I kind of want to go back to at the very beginning, you had mentioned like, if we want to dive into Catholicity, like we can do that. Like, and I think that is there, like the holiness and unity dynamics. Is that one that you think comes out of kind of the Reformed Presbyterian mindset more, or is that a Catholicity thing, or are we bringing these two together because Chris Ganski is just the perfect person at the perfect time for this?
Well, again, I think the theme of Catholicity is a big one, and how to approach this question. I guess part of it is just my experience broadly as a church historian of sorts, having had a view into lots of different denominational histories and conflicts, and just knowing how important it is, how you go about renewal and reformation matters. And, I'm 100% behind the decisions we've made as far as the human sexuality piece, and I don't think there's anything there was no, they're tough conversations no matter what. But I will say that, I am in a highly, like a liberal progressive context ministry wise. Most of my theological education took that. So like half of my friends still think that I'm crazy when it comes to this. And so I've always just had to wrestle with this tension, and I couldn't just make proclamations. I had to consider the human dimensions, the relationships and the need for oneness and trying not to break relation and all that. Yeah. And I think too, one of the things I'd love to see for us moving forward as a denomination is to live into that Reformed Catholic middle. And I don't like, we tend to only think on this political map, right, left, conservative, liberal. That has been a paradigm that has dominated the Western imagination going back to the French Revolution, where you kind of have these poles, and it's hard to get off the map. And so like one of the things I said to a few people, I was like, this Synod, I felt like the sort of centrist, moderate CRC really asserted itself again. But that's not I don't like that, because that's still a political way of thinking about it. And I always remember Henry de Moore would say, and I disagree with his statement, the CRC is like a plane. It needs a right wing and a left wing to keep it balanced, right? And I think that's a very untheological way of thinking about church.
I agree.
It's not a balancing of the right wing and the left wing to give us a moderate voice. And that's not what I'm meaning here. When I say the moderate center, I mean something more like a Catholic center, which tries to take its location from the heart of our confessional documents, not the margins. And so like one of the, to be Catholic and confessional is to, and just look at the Heidelberg. The Heidelberg is a commentary on the Apostles' Creed, and then it is a commentary on the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer. And in the beginning, it's a reflection on the relationship of law and gospel. It is very Catholic. Now, you could find places in the Catechism that are kind of polemical against the Lutherans or polemical against the Catholics. But if you just take the substance of the Catechism, it is very Catholic, which means it's broad and it sort of centers us in the triune faith. And so that's kind of what I mean when I talk about the kind of Catholic center of the Reformed tradition. And that's where we need to be pushing into, not trying to stand on the margins of those things that make us distinct from the rest of the churches in the world, right? And so you do have to try to find, like, my context is very secular, but it's also very pluralistic when it comes to other Christian traditions. So I've got people coming from all kinds of different backgrounds into my church, and Roman Catholic and Lutheran, Evangelical. And I say, the thing that draws you here, that you resonate with, that you can draw as a through line with your other experiences, is what I'll call Catholicity. That there's something that kind of unites your experiences across different traditions that we as Christians share as a whole. And I mean, it's what we say in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and it's the center, right? And I believe in the distinctives. I believe in, our doctrines of grace and as distinct things that set us apart as the things that best reflect the system of doctrine, right? But it's like, I want to start from that center, right? And I think that's not just theologically, but I also think from an institutional perspective, like, we try to start from that center and we try to pull people in and operate from there. And I think Ephesians 4 is a text in particular that I've meditated a lot on coming into this synod.
What did you do to prepare for synod? I know that, having been to synod, this would have been your fourth time going in, and you knew you were going to be on your advisory committee as a reporter, taking up the items that you did. What are some things that kind of helped prepare your hearts? I know you're kind of hinting at Ephesians 4, but I'd like our viewers to know.
Yeah. I mean, I actually gathered a little, our delegation in Wisconsin, and try to give them some advice about how to prep for synod, because a couple of them lay people had never been to synod. And I mean, the biggest thing, to prep for synod is just zero in on the reports for your committee once you find your committee. And then you have to ask the question, and there's a real art to this, I think. Like, what's at stake in this report? Like, when you're reading a report or an overture, you're like, what's at stake theologically? What's at stake? Who are the stakeholders? Who gains and who might lose from this? And what is the potential subtext beneath this overture? Because they're not always on the surface. And so that takes some time, and honestly, it's hard to do it by yourself. And it almost only happens fully when you're in advisory committee. And so that's the more polity, procedural ways of preparing. For me, I actually, again, I'm a theologian. I wish and I don't mean that in an academic sense, like I'm just an academic theologian. I hope that all pastors see themselves as theologians. But I approach it theologically, like there was a John Webster essay I reread on Peace of the Church. There's an Anglican theologian named Ephraim Radner has written a lot on the unity of the church. He has a book called The Brutal Unity, which captures the synod in the past 4 years, a brutal unity. And then I was meditating a lot on Ephesians 4, where I think you have Paul really lays out a kind of biblical vision of Catholicity. And, what Paul says there too is interesting, because if you remember how the passage starts, he says, walk in a manner according to the calling that you have been called, with all humility and gentleness. And then he goes on and talks about the oneness we have, one faith, one baptism, one Lord, one God and Father over all, right? And the way that the moral virtues are front-loaded there. You need these moral virtues of humility and gentleness in order to maintain the oneness. And the oneness is a given. It's not something we create. It is already there. And the way you break oneness is by lacking those virtues. But once you get below, then he says, starts instructing about ministers and pastors, teachers, all that. and warning against the deceptive schemes and false teaching, right? So the church can go wrong in its doctrine and its teaching, and it can go wrong in its virtue. But the oneness of the church depends upon both being held together. And, again, Paul, there's so much that Paul packs into that short chapter.
Mhm.
But I just spent a lot of time reflecting on that and just thinking about, okay, what is the agenda? How do we hold these things together? How do these things get expressed in conversations, practically speaking?
Willie, is there anything you want to say on this? Otherwise, I want to shift just a tiny bit. Pretty significant shift, but
the only thing I would say, it's not even in response to anything that you said. My sense of this synod was, I think you're right. I think there was a tendency for more discipline to be seen, but this seemed like a synod where the tone was a little softer, and some compromises were made. I don't think compromises to a fault, but pretty much I think everything that came out of an advisory committee was going to pass, I think.
Yeah.
We didn't really deviate much into majority minorities, really, and very few even friendly amendments were accepted from the floor. Just because I think that was Synod's way of saying, all right, we're going to trust the work that the committee has done and trust that this is the best way to move forward. And I say that with a word of caution and then another word of caution. My first word of caution is I'm happy that we have come together in the way that we have, and that we have clarity and unity. I'm also happy that we have extended the grace that we have to those who are maybe on the way out or who need help figuring out where to go. It's my opinion that I don't want to say too much grace, but I think grace that overpowers discipline means essentially the third mark has the potential to be lost. And that's a caution that I think is real. And I don't think that we're there in the CRC, but that's a caution that I would throw. Now, to balance that, I'm going to direct you to a conversation that I was actually in last week. And I'm even going to throw her name out there because she listens. Her name is Gina Taylor. She was commenting on the work that Messi has done, and even some that Abide has done too. And she was speaking very graciously about it and gratefully about it, saying that the church owes us a debt. And I appreciated those comments very, very much. But she said, remember, the ship is being turned in the right direction, but it turns slowly. So don't try and turn it too fast. And that's what I saw this synod. I saw us continue to move forward, but we didn't move fast. And I think that was Gina essentially being a prophetess, but essentially saying, that things are being corrected in the way that they need to be, but they're not happening in your time. They're happening in the Lord's, and they're happening, ordinarily, and they're happening surely, right? I mean, we saw some of these things manifest very much, and I'm grateful for these things. So those are the two cautions I would throw.
Yeah, Gina's right on point. She said it beautifully. Maybe you should have her on. I would agree for sure with that sentiment. So yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's that tension, right? You live in between the oneness and the holiness. Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good. So my question, I mean, to shift gears a little bit, this wasn't out of your committee, but Dr. Jared Mickelson, is that how you say his last name?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So he talked about for himself, like he talked about seeing his calling switch from being a pastor theologian to a theologian pastor, and he used I wrote this down, so I think it was a direct quote. He talked about pastoring in the academy, which I thought was just like I never really thought about it that way, but I like it. I think we should have pastors teaching our pastors that are being raised up.
Yep.
But yeah, just with your theological mindset, like what does it mean to be a pastor theologian, or how would you see that different from the more academic theologian pastor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is right up my alley.
Yes.
So I actually am a member or a fellow of the Center for Pastor Theologians. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that group, but it's a evangelical group based in Oak Park, Chicago, but of broad evangelicals, mostly pastors with PhDs, but most of them also doing like full-time ministry, not in an academic context. And so the whole purpose of that group is to really foster within the broad evangelical world a vision of the pastor as a theologian, the pastor theologian. And the first thing I would say is there's a difference between being a pastor theologian and a pastor academic. To be a pastor theologian is not to be a pastor academic. It's not the same thing. Now, they could overlap. You could be a pastor that happens to do academic stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think sometimes when people hear this, and they hear pastor theologian, and they just theology equals academic. And that's not at all. And one of the things I try to emphasize to people when I try to sort of share this vision is to say, listen, you don't have to have a PhD to be a theologian. But if you are preaching God's word, every time I step in the pulpit, I'm doing theology, right? I'm exegeting the text. I'm thinking about how it applies to people's lives. Every time somebody comes into my office to talk about or to pray, I'm doing the work of theology. Am I going to just give them sort of like the therapeutic answers that a counselor might, or am I going to ask them questions about where do you think God is active in your life? What do you think the Lord is doing? So every part of the life of the church is theological. Even Synod, even our polity, it all assumes theology. And I think, what I'd love to see in the CRC more is for us to embrace a deeper theological vision that animates all that we do. And, I might get in trouble for sharing this, but I did share with a seminary professor, and I won't name names, 10 years ago when they were coming into the denomination. I said, the problem with the CRC is not theological liberalism. The problem of the CRC is theological mediocrity. And he came to me about 7 years later and he said, you were absolutely right. And so what do I mean by theology? And the lifelong CRC people get really bent out of shape when they hear this because, we've got Nick Walterstorff and we've got Plantinga and we've got all this storied history. I'm like, my experience within the denomination very often is we have very thin, our practice is thinly informed by theology. Thinly. We're not motivated and driven by a deep theological vision. We're sort of like, well, what works? Sometimes it's pragmatism, sometimes it's sort of like institutional bureaucracy, entrepreneurial, whatever works. But we're not necessarily deeply driven by theology. And it shows in ordination exams. It shows in church plants sometimes where we're not really thinking deeply about our practices. And so I think the future of the CRC really has to be theological. It has to be like, hey, let's think deeply about what the church is. I mean, I think if I could pivot a little bit to the virtual church conversation, if I was disappointed in anything at Synod, and disappointment's too strong of a word, because I was really pleased with the conversation. I didn't agree with everything that people said, but I learned a lot about how people think about the church. And I do think that I wish there was a deeper ecclesiology that had informed that task force. Like that there was like, hey, the fact that we couldn't actually assert strongly that the church is embodied, I think is again a sign of kind of what I mean here about the theological mediocrity. Like we haven't thought deeply about the nature of the church. The idea that a sacraments, the Lord's Supper or baptism could be virtually somehow performed and be valid is not to understand the nature of a sacrament fundamentally. I don't want to get too passionate here, but I mean, again, like nothing that was said in favor of a virtual church is not something that could actually be understood or sort of accommodated with the right distinctions. Even take the distinction in ecclesiology between the church gathered and scattered, right? So the church gathered has to be embodied. There's things that happen when we're embodied that cannot happen otherwise. It's like a marriage. You meet online and imagine you can never actually be in person. Could you ever be married? No, you cannot consummate the relationship and you cannot bear children. You can be friends, right? And there's something real there, but it's not embodied. And the same with the church. There's like things happen in church that can only happen in an embodied way. Now, the church scattered. That's where the online viral or, virtual aspects we can sort of incorporate into a theology of the church scattered. But the church scattered is not the way God wants it to be, right? It's the church gathered, right? So there are a lot of theological resources and reflections that just weren't present, that did not inform that report at all. And I was really quite amazed. And again, my heart goes out to the pastoral reasons why people want to do this work.
Mm-hmm.
But even in the comments, I was struck by how much we are, as a culture, are afraid of embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're afraid of our own bodies.
There was a distinction that was drawn between like virtual church and digital ministries. And yes. I thought that was a helpful one. But a lot of this is, right, this is it's so contemporary, it is so ongoing, so nuanced that really, like the conversation drifted to like, well, it's too early, like we need to let the experiment continue. And yet it was like, no, but like you said, like, well, if we had the foundation of the vision, that directs the experiment. And I felt like that was missing too. So to draw an analogy,
to go back to the human sexuality issues, right? So when you some conversations you get into with people and you're like, the Bible doesn't permit this, or the scripture doesn't go in this direction. And it's like their whole social imaginary is so formed in a different way that to get them to a point where it might be plausible would take many, many hours and many conversations of laying a groundwork, which the study report tried to do. I myself preached through human sexuality back in 2016. And I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but I had 32 sermons on human sexuality.
Oh, wow.
It was sermon 22 before I got to Romans 1. What I was doing beforehand was building a theology of the body, of what does it mean to be created? What does it mean to be an image bearer? What is, all these, you just got to build this whole foundation before you get to the point. And I told people in the sermon, it's like, if you're listening to this sermon and you haven't listened to what I said before, you should go back because you're just going to misinterpret and misunderstand this. Now, I would say it's the same with the church. Like, we have such a flimsy grasp of what the nature of the church is that the idea that you could have a virtual church, an all virtual church, not a digital ministry, an all virtual church, seems possible. But we have such an anemic theology of the church that to be able to oppose that, people don't even have the categories to think in context of it. And so again, this is what I mean about we as a tradition have deep, rich theological resources. I mean, we have no lack of resources, but we just haven't been putting them into practice. And that's what I'd love for us to move forward doing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Chris, we're getting towards the end, or at least kind of close. So I kind of just want to ask some more broader questions here. For those who maybe haven't gone back and watched Synod yet, or, they're not going to get their Acts of Synod in the mail. What are some things that you would say people need to walk away Synod, with a view towards?
One, the Synod and the decisions of 2022, 3 and 4, and many of the predictions, especially from those who disagreed and left, that we're just going to be this right-wing denomination, a bunch of Trumpists or whatever. Those are false. That is not true. I think that's the big message, that it's not like, oh, now we're going to go, now we're going to just keep going down the line and we're just going to create this pure church. That's not true. As I said earlier, the Reformed Catholic center of the church asserted itself and said, you know what? We did some really good work, some hard work, and in terms of requiring and holiness in our church. But you know what? We're also going to do this work of unity and oneness. We're going to huddle them in tension. And it's not always comfortable, and we don't always agree with the resolutions we come up, but there's a clear direction. That would be the big thing. I think the other question, and it's not so much an observation as a future conversation, an open question. And I've been talking about it for the past 10 minutes, but what is the church? What is the nature of the church? We talk about church plants. Now again, I don't mean, I planted a church.
Mhm.
And I've been in the mix. I'd love to see some statistics on church plants that survive the pastors who plant them. I'd like to see some statistics on, are we planting like all these just really unique, creative niche ministries that do ministry for a season? Or are we planting churches that actually will be generational, one generation to the next, that is shaping and discipling people that have gone from emerging to organized? Is there a deeper ecclesiology underneath these churches, right? And it's not clear to me that's the case. I don't know. But my experience locally is that it's not. We've done more church plants in Classis, Wisconsin than we have started. And so I love the conversation about church planting that we had and the energy there. And my question is, well, what's the vision and theology that's animating and going to be moving forward here? Because we don't have a great track record as a denomination.
I think that's really good. I think that was kind of highlighted in some of our discussion about some of our ministries and church planting. And, Scott Vanderplug has always got his spiel about that, which I really appreciated. He had his moment again at Synod.
Yep.
And I think we need to get back to more of a missional mindset too.
Yep.
and actually start discipling people so that we can actually see our churches flourish.
Yeah.
Another question, kind of the final one, is not necessarily having to do with Synod, but just how would you leave our listeners looking forward into the denomination, into the future? This could be looking into your PhD, crystal ball. What do you see in the next 25, 50 years? But how should people look at the CRC going into the future based on the things that we've done this last week?
I think it should be hopeful. I'm hopeful. I think there's a lot of work to be done for renewal, but I think we laid the groundwork to actually start having the conversations that really matter now. The deep, steep decline in our denomination is not because there were a group of churches that disagreed and was taught about sexuality. That's not why our denomination has been in decline. It's not because of theological impurity that we are struggling. The reason we're struggling is because we have lacked theological vision, the courage of our own theological convictions to put them into practice and to do that hard work. And we've been enculturated into a kind of Dutch Reformed Christianity. And we're seeing that as our culture secularizes and the demographics have completely sort of changed, like what worked and in terms of like growing the church no longer works. And to grow again, we don't need gimmicks. We don't need, entrepreneurial ventures. We need a serious return theologically to our confessional sources with this missional framework in mind to say, what does it mean for us to be a Reformed church in a new generation? And I love I think honestly, the future of the CRC is probably going to be ethnic churches and people coming from outside of the denomination into it that are there because they don't know anything about, and I share this a little bit about the Dutch aspects. They're there because they love the confessions. They love the Reformed faith, and they want to be in a denomination that is taking its center there. And so I feel very positive about the denomination. I think we have my big worry, and this is a very personal worry, is like we do not have pastors, qualified pastors coming into the denomination to lead churches. Like, it is close to crisis. There are so many open churches in Wisconsin. There's like 3 or 4, and more churches. It's 2 or 3 years, and the quality of candidates has been low. And how do we we need to inspire young folks to take calls to ministry, but the work of ministry is really hard you have to think hard. You actually have to be educated. You really, it's really hard, right? And I feel like we're not willing to ask people to do that hard work, because to be a pastor that survives very long in a church, you've got to have some depth and you have to have some moral fiber. And we currently are not creating those folks. And so I worry, right? And so that's probably one of the things I worry a lot about as far as the future. And as everything I can do from my side locally to try to encourage people into the ministry, to help resource them, inspire them. The Lord, pray for the Lord raise up workers.
That's all we have for this week. If you want to help us out and support the Messy Reformation, another thing you can do is sign up for our newsletter through Substack. That way you'll get episodes and summaries sent directly into your email inbox. It also gives us the ability to communicate with our audience, which is one of the biggest struggles of a podcast. So head over to the Messy Reformation on Substack and sign up for our newsletter. But until then, don't forget this is Christ's church, and he bought it with his blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season, and keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.